Good afternoon. My name is Adam Palmer, and I am the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at Tenable. I'm going to be talking to you about cybersecurity risk, and the topic is, how secure are we? How can security leaders help effectively answer this key question from business executives of how secure are we? As quick background, Tenable is a 20-year-old publicly listed company. And I am the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist. I focused on cybersecurity for 20 years, both as a security leader in the United States and most recently as a global cyber risk director at a large bank in Europe. As I mentioned, we'll be focusing on the core question of when business leaders ask, how secure are we? They don't want a 300-page answer. They want a short, effective explanation of their cyber risk. The 5 key questions that a C-level executive must ask about cybersecurity begin with the most basic question: where are we exposed? What are the key risks? One level up of maturity for this is prioritization. What should we focus on first? Then you can start to look even further at how mature are we? How are we reducing risk, and how do we compare to our peers? With advanced metrics, all of these questions are important for a C-level executive to ask and for a security leader to answer effectively. I'm going to be focusing with you on risk-based vulnerability management. McKinsey & Company is one of the leading industry groups, consulting groups focused on supporting the industry in various areas, including cyber risk. In 2019, they found that companies that have used the risk-based management approach to cybersecurity, the same approach as Tenable, have found a reduction of 7.5 times above their original cybersecurity program of risk at no added cost. And this seems like an amazing statistic and unbelievable, it seems. But let me explain how this is achieved. It's achieved through risk-based vulnerability management, because what that helps you to do is to prioritize better. And when you prioritize better on risks, you're able to become more efficient. You can optimize. You can save money because you're focused on what really matters. So if you invest aggressively in effective vulnerability management, almost nothing else matters. Before we really focus on this, though, let's talk about the expanded attack surface. When I was a global director at a large bank, I was primarily focused on that bottom layer of traditional IT assets, the laptops, the servers, the desktops, the mobile devices. But now we have the environment with cloud devices, and we have software development in containers. So you're seeing much more expanded assets across different environments. And also beyond that, you have OT, industrial controls, operational technology, the industrial controls, the enterprise IoT. And some people might think they only have to worry about this if you're a heavy manufacturing facility or a refinery with industrial devices. But this is really a blind spot for security leaders, because we see these connected devices in all sorts of environments, almost every environment, where you have, think of all the smart access controls in your environment. Think of the HVAC, the heating air conditioning controllers. Oftentimes, these are accessed by third parties, have data, and they connect to the network. And we're seeing attackers increasingly using these as attack points to move laterally into the full IT network. And the problem is that legacy vulnerability management solutions can't keep up. They have limited visibility, ineffective prioritization, and it leads to poor communication. They simply can't handle the modern attack surface. And I'm going to share with you an example of this, a real life example. Many organizations I work with focus on using CVSS scores. The problem with CVSS scores, these are the common vulnerability scoring system scores, is that they are often up to 2 weeks old. They're out of context. They're not directly attached to an asset in your organization. And almost over about 56% of them are rated critical or high. So often organizations will say they only focus on critical or high. But if you think for a moment that if you have 100,000 vulnerabilities and 56% of those, 56,000 are critical or high, your team wastes the majority of their time chasing after the wrong issues with no prioritization, and you're not effective. So the fundamental problem is a data problem. Regardless of the size of your team and assets, you will never have enough resources to remediate every vulnerability across your attack surface if you don't prioritize effectively with a risk-based approach. So let's just spend one more minute talking about a common mistake that I see security teams make. And this is using the red, amber, green score, the RAG score, sometimes as it's called. And it looks something like this. You identify a risk in, say, Q1, maybe access management, and you label this risk as red. Then in, say, the middle of the year, after you've deployed a control, you label it as amber. Then at the end of the year, you label it green, and you say you successfully controlled the risk. The problem with this approach is that you're only measuring the deployment of a control. You haven't even identified if you effectively identified the right risk. You've just identified control deployment and you've measured implementation, but not really measured, is that control really effective? And is it even the right risk? What this approach leads to is just blind capacity building. You have a false sense of security based on incomplete data. You have easily exploitable vulnerabilities that are available to attackers. You spend time and effort addressing the wrong issues, and there's an inability to effectively communicate risk and program maturity. So I would emphasize in closing with this point that it's not adequate to build capabilities. You also must show risk reduction. By 2022, organizations that prioritize effectively and use a risk-based vulnerability management approach will suffer 80% fewer breaches, according to industry group leader Gartner. So now that we've talked about all of the things that are bad and why a risk-based approach is so important, let's talk about how to actually do that successfully. And at Tenable, we believe it starts with two pieces. The first is the Vulnerability Priority Rating, or VPR. This is creating a deep, strong understanding about the assets, or I'm sorry, about the vulnerabilities in your organization. Tenable looks at the threat recency, the threat intensity, how it's being exploited, the age of the vulnerability, and what type of threat sources is it. Is it a nation state attack? Is it a cyber criminal gang? And we leverage machine learning algorithms to calculate the priority of a vulnerability based on the real threat it actually poses with all of this other threat intelligence data. Now, let me ask you a question. If you have a deep understanding of your exploit, of the vulnerability, if I ask you a question as an example, what is the risk of a bald tire? What is the risk of a bald tire? Recently in a webinar that I conducted, I asked the participants this question, and they answered that the risk was high, maybe 85 to 90%. But in fact, it's a trick question. Actually, this is an illustration of context. If I tell you the tire is not on my automobile, but a toy for my children in my garden, the risk is actually almost zero. So this is showing the importance of knowing your assets. And this is the other half of how risk-based vulnerability management should be applied. You start with the VPR, the understanding of the vulnerability, but you must also have the ACR, the asset criticality rating. This is looking at the business purpose of the asset, the device type, what it's connected to, its capabilities, where it's located, what type of data is on it. Does it have third-party data? How is it accessed? Having that deep understanding of the assets. Leveraging algorithms. In Tenable, you leverages algorithms, proprietary algorithms to calculate the criticality of the asset and to focus prioritization efforts. Using all of this intelligence and data, you have the two critical pieces, the VPR and the ACR, to have an understanding of your risk environment. So once you have the VPR plus the ACR, you can prioritize. based on the importance of the asset and the risk it poses by the vulnerabilities on that asset. You can focus first on what matters most. And by the way, these scores, the asset criticality score is flexible. So often we see our customers might adjust that score based on their own specific knowledge of the value of that asset and its environment. And this actually just leads to a better analysis of the overall risk. But what this results in, if you apply this correctly, is that you can significantly reduce your work and become much more efficient and reduce costs. We estimate that you only have to focus on about 3 to 5% of your critical vulnerabilities to become much more effective. And to give you an example, I was talking to a CISO at a large healthcare corporation several months ago, and he started using this approach. And first, he thought he had more work because he saw many more assets. He saw all the assets across his cloud and OT environment for the first time. But then he quickly realized that he only needed to focus on about 5% of those for actual remediation. So in fact, the work became much less. And he improved, even though the work became less, he greatly improved his overall security. So let's talk again about what many companies do with vulnerability management. It's often seen, unfortunately, as a monitoring tool. I see companies that scan infrequently. They don't use authentication during scans. The security team often reports raw findings to the operations team, maybe a PDF. And it basically looks like a simple process of analyze, prioritize, report, and then just relax. This is really vulnerability assessment, but not true vulnerability management. Risk-based vulnerability management is really much more. A true risk-based vulnerability management approach should contain, to start, the vulnerability assessment piece, but also validation, prioritization, understanding the context, like we talked about. It's looking at patch management and remediation, software security assessments from development through DevOps into production, a testing, retesting, and quality assurance process, and really quantitative reporting metrics and analysis for all levels of the organization. Done effectively, risk-based VM identifies where your organization is exposed, it drives remediation, and it reduces risk. But I also want to stop a minute and focus again on something that I started with, and this is being mindful of the convergence between OT and IT risk. Because it's just so often, I think this is a critical blind spot of these operational technologies that are often very old, legacy industrial controls that are now connected. And we have seen organizations already in the last year, I could give several examples, where we saw industrial technology or operational controls in different environments targeted, attackers move laterally into the wider IT environment and really cause millions in costs of money to these organizations and really shut down their operations. So be aware of the vulnerability gaps in your OT environment. There's an IT-OT convergence. Often I see CISO with no visibility into these OT environments. Many of them are very old. They have multiple configuration changes. There's never been any tracking about monitoring who accesses them. And they're simply outdated equipment with undocumented controls and no configuration tracking. And they're more often invisible in your overall asset inventory. Sometimes I hear security leaders talk about that they're air-gapped. Their industrial controls, these operational OT controllers, don't connect to their environment. But I'd encourage you to look, and you'll probably see a lot of controllers like this that have a connection and almost guarantee that there are many parties you're unaware of, maybe even outside third parties that are connecting to this, which is exposing your entire security, your entire IT environment. It's also important to think about how you assess these controls and their security. You must have really both active and passive monitoring. Active querying leverages the native protocols inside the environment to identify the assets, even when they're not communicating with your network. But if you only use active query, and I see some organizations that only do this, you're only going to see a very small percentage of the assets because it's only when they're actively communicating. And we know that some of these industrial controls are offline many times, and it's very infrequent that they communicate. So you also have to include passive monitoring to identify the assets, as they communicate. Or I'm sorry, I mixed that a little to say the active querying when they're not communicating, and the passive monitoring when they are communicating. If you passive monitoring only when they're not, will only detect when they're not communicating, but active querying will identify using the native communication technologies when they're not communicating with your network. But you need both active and passive monitoring, both, so that you get the full picture of your assets. Now, some people are concerned about active querying because they're concerned that maybe it will take an asset offline. But really, it safely queries in the same way the manufacturers monitor, and it only reads information. There's no configuration changes and zero impact to your network. If you're only relying on passive monitoring, you're missing 50% of the attacks potentially, and assets, or you're missing 50% of the assets in your environment, and potentially a huge number of the attacks. The key is to gain situational awareness on every asset. Identify the assets that are communicating on your network, discover which devices are not active or communicating, make sure you're classifying all of the PLC, servers, switches, routers, collecting all the information about the firmware levels, the users, any of the hotfix levels for those devices, and make sure that you have tracking of full configuration changes and controls included on those devices. So visibility plus understanding of all of the changes in those controls. Gain situational awareness on every asset in your environment. So I want to close with just a summary of the cyber exposure process that we'll describe. Some of you may be starting at that traditional vulnerability management approach at the bottom there, which is heavily people-powered, very compliance-driven. You're just trying to ask that fundamental question, where are we exposed? And even if you're starting there, I would strongly encourage you to begin to move up to that next layer of risk-based vulnerability management. This is really powered by machine learning and continuous assessment. You're answering critical questions like, where should we prioritize based on risk? And how do we compare to our peers? These are really fundamental, critical questions that you begin to be able to analyze with quantitative data. And you're using the machine learning, and you're using deep insight about the exploits that are attacking you and the assets that are linked to those. Then finally, to achieve full maturity cyber exposure management, you start to really connect your security program to the business. And this is really about answering critical questions like, are we reducing risk over time? Are we measuring and improving our security program? And are we including analytics beyond basic vulnerability management? Often, I talk to organizations and they're unsure of how to start and really begin this process. And I would encourage you to begin to do comparisons between these two different approaches. And don't fall into the blind capacity building approach. I once had a chief risk officer describe his approach at a large bank in Europe, told me his approach to cyber risk management was what I'll call the beat the bear fallacy. And he said it was like this: there are two friends running in a forest, and there's bears in the forest. And the one friend starts to put on running shoes, and he turns to the other friend and asks, why are you putting on shoes? You can't outrun the bears. And to which the other friend replies, I don't need to outrun the bears. I only need to outrun you. How many of you are taking that blind rag score approach, or using the beat the bear approach, where you're just trying to be a little better than your neighbor on security, and you're not really analyzing the risk? This is really a recipe for cost overruns. You just keep investing in new controls, but you're never really measuring, are you actually creating value for the cybersecurity program? Are you actually reducing risk? So as a CEO recently told me of another company, said, if you invest in aggressive vulnerability management, it's the foundation of your security program, and almost nothing else matters. So be mindful of the blind spots in things like operational technology, awareness of the expanded risk environment across the cloud as well as the OT environment, and begin starting to ask these next level questions about how you can prioritize based on risk and connecting your security program to the business to become a business aligned security leader. The future belongs to the business aligned security leader, and Tenable can support you to achieve that goal. This is my personal email address. I welcome any questions. I encourage you to reach out to me individually, or feel free to look at the Tenable.com website, where we have lots of information that includes free white papers and how we calculate these different scores. And all of this can assist you to analyze the risk-based VM approach. And also feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk anytime and share my experiences as a security leader with you and how I saw risk-based VM implemented in organizations where I worked. Thank you, and it was a pleasure to share this, and I wish you all the very best in your security program and future.